Hey, step away from that car. Let me see some ID now.
Afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?
Yeah, the problem is you're hanging around these cars acting real suspicious. This isn't a place to be browsing unless you got
looking at
business.
the vehicle.
Officer Garrett Pike was 38 years old and had spent 11 years with the Scottsdale Police Department, developing a reputation that his evaluations described as assertive and his complaint file described differently. 4 formal complaints in 11 years. 4 separate individuals who had documented the same pattern, stops that lacked articulated cause, a tone that shifted depending on who was standing in front of him, and an approach to control that arrived before the assessment that was supposed to precede it. All 4 complaints had been reviewed. All 4 had been closed. The department's position, each time, was that Pike had operated within acceptable parameters. The people who filed the complaints understood that the parameters had been written to accommodate exactly what he was doing. On a Tuesday afternoon in Scottsdale, dispatch received a call from Desert Crown Motor Gallery, a luxury dealership on the north end of the city whose inventory ranged from $80,000 to well past $150,000, reporting a suspicious individual walking between vehicles on the front lot. Pike heard the call, responded immediately, and pulled into the dealership entrance 2 minutes later with the particular momentum of a man who had already written the broad outline of what he was about to find. What Garrett Pike did not know, what he was approximately 14 days away from understanding in the most professionally terminal way possible, was that the man standing beside the gray luxury sedan on the front lot of Desert Crown Motor Gallery was Judge Raymond Caldwell. United States District Court Judge. 28 years on the federal bench. Former civil rights attorney with a 15-year practice that had included cases involving unlawful detention, racial profiling, and police misconduct. A man who had, across his career, written legal opinions that defined what probable cause required and what it did not permit. The detention Pike was about to conduct would be reviewed by Internal Affairs within 72 hours. The body camera footage would be pulled the same day. The dealership's security system covered every inch of the front lot. The witnesses had already raised their phones. Pike's career would not survive the month. Before this story goes any further, drop in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe walking through a car dealership should never require a justification, like this video, subscribe, and stay with us. These stories are told so they stop needing to be. Raymond Caldwell had driven in from Phoenix that afternoon after a morning session at the federal courthouse that had run 40 minutes longer than scheduled. He was 56 years old, unhurried by nature, and had been considering a vehicle purchase for the better part of 6 weeks, not urgently, but with the methodical patience he applied to most decisions, gathering information before committing to a conclusion. He had passed Desert Crown Motor Gallery twice on the drive between Phoenix and his Scottsdale residence and had noted it both times as a place worth stopping. That afternoon, with the hearing behind him and no further obligations until the following morning, he decided the stop was overdue. He parked in the customer lot, walked through the dealership's front entrance, exchanged brief pleasantries with a sales consultant near the door, and moved outside to examine the vehicles on the front row at his own pace. He had been on the lot for less than 10 minutes when he heard the cruiser pull in. He was dressed without announcement, dark slacks, a collared shirt, a light jacket appropriate to the Scottsdale afternoon. No credentials visible. No identifiers of any institutional kind. He had spent nearly 3 decades in professional environments where the work spoke before the person did, and he had long since stopped feeling any need to signal his position through appearance. He was a man looking at a car. That was the entirety of what was happening on the front lot of Desert Crown Motor Gallery when Garrett Pike stepped out of his cruiser. The Scottsdale afternoon was bright and dry, the kind of desert clarity that makes surfaces sharp and shadows precise. Desert Crown Motor Gallery's front lot stretched across a quarter-acre of polished concrete, rows of luxury vehicles angled outward at uniform intervals, their bodies reflecting the sky in long, clean panels of light. The showroom behind them was glass from floor to ceiling, and through it, the interior of the dealership, consultation desks, a coffee station, 2 sales consultants in conversation near a display model, was fully visible to anyone on the lot. It was the kind of environment designed to communicate abundance before a word was spoken. Raymond Caldwell stood beside a charcoal gray sedan near the 3rd row, examining the interior through the driver's window with the unhurried attention of someone who had not yet decided whether the vehicle warranted a closer look. His posture was relaxed and upright simultaneously, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people accustomed to sitting in rooms where composure is professional currency. He was reading the instrument panel through the glass when the sound of a car door reached him from the lot entrance. He turned. Pike was already moving toward him, not walking with the observational pace of an officer arriving to assess an unknown situation, but with the forward drive of someone whose assessment had already been completed in the cruiser. His eyes had found Caldwell before his feet had fully cleared the vehicle, and the trajectory of his approach was not the trajectory of inquiry. It was the trajectory of conclusion. He stopped several feet away and looked at Caldwell with the particular quality of attention that is less observation than inventory: face, clothing, the jacket, the absence of anything that announced belonging, before his voice came out sharp enough to carry across 2 rows of vehicles. Caldwell turned fully and met the officer's gaze with the composed attention of someone who had heard raised voices in professional settings his entire career and had learned, long ago, that the most effective response to them was stillness. He kept his hands visible at his sides. He did not step back from the vehicle. He asked, with measured calm, whether there was a problem. Pike told him there was. He referenced a call. He gestured toward the vehicles with the implication that Caldwell's presence among them required explanation, that the lot itself was a kind of context that certain people needed to justify entering, and that Caldwell had not yet provided the justification. Caldwell did not perform confusion or offense. He acknowledged the officer directly and identified himself as a customer examining the vehicles. His tone was the tone of a man providing a fact, not a defense, because the fact was complete and the situation, as he understood it, required nothing more. Pike's expression did not shift toward acceptance. It shifted toward skepticism of the particular variety that is not produced by evidence but imported into a situation before the evidence has been examined. He stepped closer. His language moved from the report to the vehicles themselves, their cost, their category, the implied relationship between those things and the men standing beside them. The implication was not subtle. It was not designed to be. Inside the showroom, 2 employees had stopped their conversation and were facing the glass. One of them took a step toward the door. Caldwell noted the movement without redirecting his attention. He kept his focus on Pike and asked, with the same measured register he had maintained from the first word, for the specific legal basis of the detention being implied. The question was precise and procedural because precision and procedure were Caldwell's native language, the language he had used in courtrooms for 28 years, in briefs, in opinions, in hearings where the difference between a lawful stop and an unlawful one came down to exactly the kind of articulation Pike was now failing to provide. Pike interpreted the question as resistance. His tone dropped into the register that authority adopts when it feels challenged, lower, slower, more deliberate, calibrated to communicate that the next step would not be conversational. He demanded identification. He did not provide the legal grounding that the demand required. He stood close enough that the reduction of space was itself a form of pressure, and he watched Caldwell with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction that would confirm what he had already decided. Caldwell did not provide it. He stood with his hands visible and his posture unchanged and asked, without elevation or agitation, whether he was being formally detained and what the articulable basis for that detention was. The questions were not aggressive. They were the questions any person with a working knowledge of the Fourth Amendment was entitled to ask, and Caldwell asked them in the tone of someone who had cited that amendment in writing more times than Pike had been on the force. A sales consultant had come through the showroom door and was standing several yards from the exchange, close enough to observe, far enough to communicate uncertainty about whether to involve himself. 2 customers near the adjacent row had phones at angles that suggested they were no longer reviewing messages. Pike stepped forward and closed his hand around Caldwell's wrist. The contact drew a visible reaction from the people watching, a collective adjustment, a sharpening of attention, the particular quality of an audience registering that a threshold has been crossed. Caldwell did not pull away. He did not raise his voice. He stated clearly and without inflection that the contact was not warranted and that the officer should reconsider what he was doing. His language was not a plea. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who had issued similar statements in formal settings and understood their weight. Pike drew the handcuffs. The sound they made clearing the belt was small and mechanical and carried across the polished silence of the front lot with the precision of a period at the end of a sentence. The sales consultant near the door said something quietly. A woman browsing near the far row stopped walking. The showroom manager, visible through the glass, had left his desk. Caldwell allowed his hands to be drawn behind him without resistance. He did not stop speaking. He named what was happening: the absence of probable cause, the absence of articulable suspicion, the presence of multiple witnesses, in the measured, sequential way that a person names things when they intend the naming to serve a purpose later. Each statement was precise. Each one landed in the air of the dealership lot with the quiet permanence of something being recorded, because it was. Pike told him he talked too much. The cuffs closed. Caldwell stood on the front lot of Desert Crown Motor Gallery with his hands restrained behind him and the afternoon sun reflecting off $100,000 worth of vehicles in every direction, and he said, without drama, that he was a judge. Pike's response was dismissive, the verbal equivalent of a shrug, the particular contempt of a man who has heard people claim authority in difficult moments and learned to treat the claim as a tactic. Caldwell did not repeat himself. He had said what was true. The truth did not require his advocacy. The showroom door opened again. The dealership manager came through it quickly, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had found something and understood its significance, holding a tablet at chest height, his expression carrying the specific quality of a person who has just recognized that the situation on his lot is considerably more serious than it appeared 60 seconds ago. He stopped beside Pike and turned the screen outward. Pike looked down at it. His eyes moved across the page. Then they moved back to the men standing in handcuffs in front of him. Then back to the screen. The afternoon held itself exactly where it was, bright, dry, and entirely still, while 11 years of unchecked assumptions prepared to meet their consequence. The tablet screen held its information without apology. The dealership manager kept it turned outward at chest height, steady and deliberate, and what it displayed was not ambiguous: a federal court biography page, a professional photograph, a name printed beneath an institutional seal with the particular authority of documentation that does not require interpretation. The men in the photograph and the men standing in handcuffs on the front lot of Desert Crown Motor Gallery were the same person, rendered in the same composed expression, carrying the same precise stillness that had been present from the moment Pike had first crossed the lot toward him. Pike looked at the screen for several seconds. Then he looked at Caldwell. Then back at the screen. The movement was involuntary, the eyes of a person whose certainty has just encountered something it cannot immediately process, searching the gap between what it expected and what it found for a resolution that the evidence was not going to provide. He handed the tablet back. His voice, when he spoke, had the particular flatness of a man defaulting to posture because position was no longer available. He said the information didn't change anything. The manager's expression answered him without words. Caldwell said nothing. He had already said everything that needed to be said, in the sequence it needed to be said, and he understood with the patience of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades in rooms where outcomes were determined by the quality of the record rather than the volume of the argument, that the record being assembled on this lot was sufficient. He did not need to add to it. The second patrol vehicle arrived 4 minutes after the manager had produced the tablet. The officer who stepped out was younger than Pike and moved with the measured observation of someone who had learned, early enough for it to matter, that the first thing to assess in an unknown situation was not the subject but the structure, the crowd, the positions, the quality of the tension, the story the scene was telling before anyone opened their mouth. He read it quickly. His eyes moved from the small crowd near the showroom entrance, to Pike's posture, to the handcuffs, to the men wearing them, and at the men wearing them, his gaze stopped with the specific quality of recognition that is not produced by a name but by presence, by the bearing of someone whose authority has a particular signature that certain professional environments learn to identify on sight. He had seen Judge Raymond Caldwell twice before, both times at the federal courthouse, once in a corridor and once in an elevator, and both times the judge had carried himself with exactly the stillness he was carrying now, unchanged by the cuffs, unchanged by the audience, unchanged by anything the morning had introduced. He approached Caldwell directly. He addressed him by title. The 2 words, "Your Honor," landed on the dealership lot with the effect of a key turning in a lock that Pike had not known existed, and the crowd's collective posture shifted in the half-second it took for the acknowledgement to complete itself. The people on that lot had a choice in that moment, and most of them had already made it with their phones. But if you had been standing there, what would you have done? Type "speak" or "silent" in the comments and tell us what you think you would have chosen, and why. There is no wrong answer. Only an honest one. What the footage would not capture, what would only become visible in the days following, as the story moved from the dealership lot into the institutional channels that process these events, was the particular dimension of irony embedded in the afternoon's events. 18 months before the confrontation at Desert Crown Motor Gallery, Judge Raymond Caldwell had presided over a federal civil rights case involving an unlawful detention at a commercial property in Arizona. The plaintiff had been stopped without articulable cause, questioned without legal basis, and physically restrained in front of witnesses by an officer who had cited a vague third-party report as justification. Caldwell's written opinion in that case had been 41 pages. It had established, with the methodical precision that his opinions were known for, the specific threshold that reasonable suspicion required and the specific failures that transformed a lawful investigative stop into a Fourth Amendment violation. The policies the Scottsdale Police Department had adopted in response to that ruling were the same policies Pike had violated in the 11 minutes since stepping out of his cruiser. Caldwell had written the standard. Pike had discarded it. And the man standing in handcuffs on the front lot was the author of the document that would form the evidentiary backbone of the complaint that was already, in practical terms, assembling itself. The senior officer arrived 6 minutes later. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stepped out of a black department vehicle and crossed the lot with the economy of movement that belongs to someone who has been doing this long enough to know that unnecessary speed communicates panic and panic is never useful. He assessed the scene in the time it took him to cover the distance, the witnesses, the phones, the second officer standing near Caldwell, Pike's isolated posture, the manager holding a tablet with the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. He stopped in front of Caldwell. His expression did not perform surprise or apology. It performed accountability, the specific, functional version of it that does not require volume or gesture, only clarity. He turned to Pike and gave a single instruction. Pike stood still for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. The hesitation was visible to everyone watching, and what it communicated, the brief, involuntary resistance of a man whose certainty had not fully caught up to his circumstances, was recorded by several phones simultaneously. Then he stepped behind Caldwell and unlocked the handcuffs. The sound they made opening was the same sound they had made closing. Small. Mechanical. Precise. But the room the sound occupied had entirely changed. Caldwell brought his hands forward. He adjusted his jacket once, a single, unhurried motion, and stood in the Scottsdale afternoon with the same posture he had maintained from the beginning. He did not look at Pike. He did not address the crowd. He looked at Webb and spoke with the measured directness of someone who had delivered thousands of formal statements and understood that clarity, delivered calmly, was always more durable than anger delivered loudly. He named what had occurred. The absence of probable cause. The physical contact without justification. The statements implying he did not belong in the space he was legally occupying. The presence of multiple witnesses and multiple recording devices. He said he would be filing a formal complaint and that he expected a full internal review including the body camera record from the moment Pike's cruiser entered the lot. Webb confirmed each point with a nod that was not performative. It was the nod of someone taking notes in a register that does not require paper. The crowd had stopped pretending not to watch. The dealership employees near the showroom entrance stood in a loose cluster, their discomfort now openly visible, the particular discomfort of people who understand that the institution they represent has been implicated in something it will need to formally address. The manager, Elliot Granger, had already spoken quietly to one of his staff and sent them back inside, presumably toward the security system controls. Pike stood apart from the group. His body camera was running. His earlier confidence had not transformed into remorse, it had simply vacated, leaving behind the hollow, upright posture of a man performing composure in the absence of the certainty that had been providing it. He said something to Webb in a low voice that carried the structure of justification without the substance of it. Webb listened without his expression changing. Then Webb spoke, and whatever he said was brief enough that it did not require a response, and Pike did not attempt one. The formal complaint reached the department's Internal Affairs Division the following morning, accompanied by Caldwell's written account, Webb's incident report, the body camera footage reviewed and flagged by a supervising officer before the end of the shift, and the security system recordings from Desert Crown Motor Gallery, which covered every angle of the front lot from Pike's arrival to the removal of the handcuffs. Witness statements from 4 customers and 2 employees were collected within 48 hours. The prior complaints emerged during the review with the inevitability of patterns that have been waiting for a context large enough to make them undeniable. 4 complaints. 4 individuals. The same behavioral signature across 11 years, escalation without cause, detention without articulation, a threshold for suspicion that shifted depending on who was standing in front of him. Each complaint had been reviewed in isolation and found insufficient. Reviewed in sequence, alongside the body camera footage from the dealership lot, they formed something the department could no longer process as a series of learning curves. Pike was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours. The termination came 17 days after the incident. The documentation cited misconduct, unlawful detention, and a pattern of conduct that prior reviews had identified and failed to address at the level the pattern required. The department simultaneously announced the introduction of revised probable cause standards for commercial property stops, mandatory supervisor notification requirements for any detention lasting beyond 5 minutes, and a review threshold for complaints involving similar behavioral patterns across multiple incidents. Desert Crown Motor Gallery issued a public statement 9 days after the confrontation. It acknowledged that the initial report to police had been made without adequate cause, that the employee responsible had been disciplined, and that the dealership was implementing a formal review of its customer interaction protocols. The statement did not fully absorb the criticism that followed it, but it was issued, and it was on record. Caldwell did not hold a press conference. He did not give interviews. He submitted his formal complaint, provided his written account, and returned to the federal courthouse the following morning for a scheduled hearing that ran on time. On the afternoon of the incident, after Webb had concluded his initial conversation with Pike and the lot had begun its slow return to operational rhythm, Caldwell retrieved his car from the customer parking area, nodded briefly to the second officer who had addressed him by title, and drove back toward Phoenix on the same road he had taken that morning. The gray sedan he had been examining remained on the front lot in its angled position, its surface catching the late afternoon light without any record of what had occurred beside it. The dealership lot returned to quiet. Customers who had lingered dispersed in ones and twos. The showroom resumed its function. The polished surfaces reflected the sky without distinction, indifferent to the hour that had just passed. The lesson the afternoon had produced was not housed in the termination or the policy revisions or the dealership statement, though all of those things were necessary and all of them were real. It was housed in the 41 pages Caldwell had written 18 months earlier, in the standard those pages had established, and in the demonstration, conducted involuntarily, in public, on a Scottsdale car lot, that the standard existed because the situation it described had always been possible, would always be possible, and required not outrage to address but documentation, procedure, and the disciplined patience of someone willing to let the record speak at full volume. Authority that cannot withstand a question about its own basis is not authority. It is assumption wearing authority's clothing, and it holds only until something more durable arrives to stand beside it. What stood beside it that afternoon had been there from the beginning, composed, precise, and entirely prepared to wait.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.